Again, I wanted to say just a word about last week. We had Rick Bennett here in our service last week, and it was the first opportunity that I'd had to meet Rick. And I want to tell you how impressed I was with him. It was just a blessing. We went out to lunch with him, and it was just a blessing to get to know him and to see him as a person. And I just am so excited about his being the leader of Corporate Baptist Fellowship in Tennessee. And I'm going to invite him the next time that I'm out of service, if he can come, to come and preach for us, because I think he would do such a good job, and he was so complimentary of our church. And he made the statement that he'd rather have a lot of churches small like us with so much love than he would a bunch of big churches that didn't have the love that we had. So I just appreciated his observation, and I think that you will love him when I do that. So be praying about that'll work out. Everybody has different emotions when they walk into the sanctuary and see the Lord's Supper set up. I've had different emotions. I've seen different emotions as people have come in. Even to the point that one Sunday I saw a couple come in and they saw the Lord's Supper set up and they said, "Oh, we don't want to stay for this," and they left. And then I've had others, on the other hand, who talked about how meaningful it was to participate in the Lord's Supper, the communion, and how it blessed them. So a lot of it depends on you. And I think that's part of what the Scripture teaches us. Prepare ourselves. Examine yourselves before you start to participate in the supper. And make sure that your heart is right. And if your heart is right, then it's going to mean something to you. So I encourage you right now, even in this instance, to just say, "God, cleanse me. Prepare me for what you want me to hear today." I want to read two verses of Scripture that are not typically read at the Lord's Supper, from John chapter 15, verses 12 and 13, just two short verses. "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for his friends." Jesus was talking about other people, but he also, I think, had to include himself in that. Greater love has no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. And that's exactly what he did for us. And that's what we remember today as we think about the Lord's Supper. I would point you to two things that I think the supper should mean to all of us as Christians. One is an opportunity for us to look back to his death, and as we partake of the drink which reminds us of his spilled blood, and the bread which reminds us of his broken body, we remember how he gave his life to die for us, how he cared that much about us and loved us that much. But I also want you to think about the other end of the spectrum. When we look at the future, toward the future and that heavenly banquet that we will one day be able to participate in when we all die and go to heaven. That will be the consummation of it all. And that will be a really meaningful experience for us. So as we think about those two things today, let it prepare us for observance of the Lord's Supper and thinking about his broken body and his shed blood. The Scripture teaches us that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Isn't that amazing? The reason he came was to serve and to give his life. That's what his goal was from the very beginning. That's what his purpose was from the very beginning, and he did that. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. Sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we as Christians don't put enough emphasis on lost people. But that's what Jesus did in his life. He came to save men who were lost. in a cemetery of dead values. How many people do you know whose values are dead? They have no real value in their life, nothing to give meaning to their life. He came to save men who were lost in the depersonalization of computers and gadgets. You listen to some of those reports on TV where psychologists study about what computers and gadgets are doing to our children. They're getting lost from society and interacting with each other and living together. And that's sad, isn't it? And when somebody gets so caught up in those kind of things that there's nothing personal in their life anymore, I think that's one of the saddest things that you can ever witness. Jesus came for men who were lost in the game of corporate success. How many people do you know who've lost their family and lost their life by getting caught up in their jobs, trying to climb the corporate ladder, trying to get to the top of the ladder? And if you're like me, you know so many who got to the top of the ladder and they found out it was leaning against the wrong wall. And it wasn't satisfying. They weren't happy. They were miserable. There is more to life than just being successful at your job. Jesus came for the lost people who are caught up in a life of pornographic filth as a last refuge for unsatisfactory relationships. Pornography is so awful. It destroys so many people, destroys their life, destroys their personality, destroys their family. But that's the kind of people that Jesus came for. He came to save men who were lost in the agony of loneliness. Jean's friend who called last night, she had the phone on speaker and I could hear him. And he broke down and cried and talked about how lonely he was. A lot of lonely people in our world. Some of them right next to you, some of them in your family, maybe even at times you. Lonely. Loneliness is a hard thing. Men who are lost in the despair of drug addiction. Broken-hearted people who cry over their children. Sandy Draper last week talking to me and Jean about Derek. They've tried so many things. They sent him to rehab in Mississippi. He came back and it wasn't a week before he was right back on drugs again. And those things don't satisfy. Those are not the answers. Men who are lost in the horror of rejection. It's hard to be rejected, isn't it? It's hard to be rejected. And when you feel rejection, it's hard to feel good about yourself. Very hard. Men who are old and unforgotten. A lot of lonely old people in our world. You hear about in the last week on the news all the senior adults who've been taken advantage of. Literally billions of dollars that scammers have taken from them. And a lot of the reason is because when they get a phone call from somebody that's a friendly voice, they're so taken in by it that somebody cares when they don't care at all. They're just trying to scam them. But they're lonely. They're forgotten. Their families don't remember them, or they don't have any family left. That's the kind of people that Jesus died for. The poor, the desperate, the angry. You know how many people are angry at the world? And angry at themselves because they haven't done better? They're angry at themselves because of the conditions they're having to live in? All of us know people who are like that. And so my question to you this morning is this: if that's the kind of people that Jesus came to die for, if that's the reason we remember the Lord's Supper, because of what Jesus was about, then shouldn't we be about the same thing? Shouldn't it be our responsibility to seek those same kind of people. And when I say that we need to be looking for those kind of people and seeking those kind of people, I don't mean that we should ring the church bell or play the organ or piano loud and expect them to come running to us. They're not going to do that. We need every day to be alert, to be sensitive to the people around us. And you'll be surprised if you'll just be sensitive to know how many people you could touch every day who need to know about God. Jesus came across the dispossessed, the disenchanted, the diseased, and what did he do? He reached out and he touched them. He touched the exposed, ulcerated sores, both the physical and the spiritual. What did society do? All the people around him watched what he did, and they realized that the laws of sanitation were not being kept. You're not supposed to touch a leper, you're supposed to stay away from it. They realized that their whole culture was being torn apart by Jesus and the way that he ministered to people. And all their fears, they recoiled in horror. What did Jesus do? Jesus still touched and loved and ministered and healed and cared about all those people. So what does the Lord's Supper do for us? What does it do for us? Jesus said, as often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. And I don't think he was just saying, remember me as a person. I think he was saying, do it in remembrance of all that I did, in remembrance of all of my ministry, in remembrance of me touching that ulcerated person, in remembrance of me caring about the outcasts that nobody else wanted to have anything to do with. And so the Lord's Supper should remind us of our responsibility. Why are we here as Believers Baptist Fellowship? Now, I'm grateful that we're here for the fellowship. I'm grateful that we're here for the love. I'm grateful for all that we have in each other, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. But I want to tell you that's not enough. Our purpose as a church is to go beyond that and to share that same kind of love with the people out there who need to hear it. To care about those people that nobody else cares about. To minister to those people that everybody else lets fall through the crack. That's what we're here for. We're to be Christ in this community. And there is a very real sense, I believe, from the teaching of the Scripture, that the church is the continuing incarnation of God in this world. Now, a lot of people may say, well, that's blasphemy to say that human being could be the continuing incarnation of God. But as I read the Scripture, and I read the bottom line, and I look at it, I think that's exactly what Jesus wants us to be. He wants us to be his representative. He wants people to look at us and see God. So we have a tremendous responsibility and a tremendous opportunity to go out there in the world and make a big, big difference. If there is hunger, listen carefully. If there is hunger, feed it. If there is nakedness, clothe it. If there is hurt, bind it. If there is brokenness, heal it. That's the opportunity we have. If we get ourselves involved in the lives of others, and you know what? Sometimes that's not easy. Sometimes that's so hard. Sometimes when you have to deal with some people who are not upstanding, friendly, caring people, and you have to deal with them, it's tough. It's tough. But who needs the help any worse than they do? That's the kind of people Jesus touched. And so, we have that same responsibility. There are not a lot of options that I see when I look at the scripture, because Jesus spoke to us and he said, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. Tremendous responsibility.